What if the greatest mistake Prince Harry ever made wasn't leaving the royal family, but choosing who he believed when it mattered most? Sit with that for a second, because for years, the public story has been simple, clean, convenient. A fairy tale turned tragedy. A prince falls in love. The palace pushes back. Racism, tradition, pressure, and cold royal walls force a young family to flee for their sanity. End of story. But what if that version is incomplete? What if the real fracture didn't begin with the tabloids, or the palace, or even the press? What if it began in private conversations, late at night, in whispers that sounded like comfort but slowly rewrote reality? At 41 years old, Prince Harry now stands at a strange crossroads. He's no longer the reckless spare. He's no longer the rebellious younger brother. He's a husband, a father, a man old enough to look backward with clarity instead of adrenaline. And according to multiple reported accounts, insiders, and Harry's own words over time, he's begun doing exactly that, replaying moments, re-examining loyalties, and quietly confronting a possibility that once would have felt unthinkable, that the woman he believed saved him may have helped destroy the one relationship that defined his life long before she arrived, his bond with Prince William. Ask yourself something honestly. How many times in your own life have you looked back and realized a choice you defended fiercely at the time didn't age well? How many times did loyalty feel like love until it felt like isolation? Harry's story matters now because the noise has finally faded. The interviews are over. The books have been written. The applause has softened. And what remains is silence. And silence is dangerous when you're left alone with your thoughts. For nearly 4 decades, Prince Harry's emotional center wasn't a palace or a title. It wasn't the monarchy or the crown. It was his brother. 2 boys walking behind a coffin. 2 sons grieving the same mother. 2 young men forged by trauma, fame, and loss in a way no one else on earth could truly understand. William wasn't just Harry's brother. He was his anchor, his translator, his protector in a world that never stopped watching. So when Harry says, according to reported claims, that someone drove a wedge between them on purpose, the weight of that accusation isn't small. It's nuclear, because wedges don't fall from the sky. They are placed carefully, gradually, almost invisibly. This story isn't about blaming one person for everything that went wrong. It's not about declaring villains or heroes. It's about something far more uncomfortable. How relationships can be reshaped from the inside. How encouragement can become exclusion. How love can quietly demand distance from everyone else. And how, sometimes, by the time you realize what's happening, the damage is already done. Harry has spoken openly about feeling trapped by the institution he was born into. About feeling unheard, unsupported, angry, vulnerable. And those feelings were real. But here's the question no one wanted to ask when emotions were running hot. Who was shaping how he interpreted those feelings? Who helped define who was safe and who was suddenly against him? Because according to reported accounts and interpretations of Harry's own reflections, Meghan didn't just position herself as his partner. She allegedly positioned herself as his only ally. Think about that. Not your wife alongside your family, but your wife instead of your family. And that distinction matters more than people realize. At the time, it didn't sound sinister. It sounded romantic. You don't need them. You have me. How many movies have you watched where that line is framed as devotion? How many songs celebrate it? But in real life, when someone asks you to narrow your world until they are the center, the consequences are rarely romantic. They are lonely. Harry didn't wake up one day and decide to turn his back on his brother. No one does. That kind of rupture happens in stages. First comes discomfort. Then comes reinterpretation. Then comes distance. And finally, justification. This introduction isn't here to convict anyone. It's here to slow the story down, to strip away the headlines and ask what was happening beneath them. Because the truth, if there is one, isn't clean. It's messy, emotional, contradictory. Harry has admitted he was angry at William, hurt by him, felt judged, felt controlled, felt dismissed. But anger doesn't erase history, and pain doesn't mean manipulation never occurred. Both things can exist at the same time. That's the part audiences weren't ready to hear when the drama was loud. Now, with time, age, and distance, the picture looks different. This isn't the story of a man escaping villains. It's the story of a man choosing between identities, between being a son and a husband, a brother and a partner, a prince and a private citizen. And those choices don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in conversations, reactions, reinforcements. Harry has repeatedly said he felt William was influenced by the palace. But what if Harry himself was influenced too? That question isn't cruel. It's human. All of us are influenced by the people closest to us, especially when we're vulnerable, especially when they're the ones offering comfort, especially when they frame concern as control and disagreement as betrayal. Imagine this for a moment. You're Harry. You've spent your life in your brother's shadow, but also under his protection. Suddenly, you fall deeply in love with someone who sees the world completely differently. She validates your pain. She encourages your anger. She assures you that you are right to feel wronged. And slowly, she reframes the people who question your choices as threats instead of family. Not overtly, subtly, with words like, they don't understand you, and they don't want you happy, and you don't need their approval. Each sentence sounds harmless. Each one feels supportive. Until you realize you're no longer picking up the phone. You're no longer explaining. You're no longer willing to hear the other side. Because why would you, when you've been told that the other side never cared in the first place? This is how wedges work. They don't shout. They whisper. And Harry, by his own admission, was already primed for that whisper. He carried unresolved grief, long-standing resentment, a sense of being the spare, a belief that he was never truly chosen by the institution. So when someone came along who said, I choose you, fully, completely, against everyone else if I have to, it felt like salvation. But salvation can be intoxicating, and intoxication clouds judgment. Now fast forward to today. Harry is no longer in his 20s or 30s. He's 41, old enough to realize that loyalty doesn't have to require isolation, old enough to recognize patterns, old enough to question moments he once defended without hesitation. And according to those who observe his recent tone, something has shifted. He sounds less certain, less fiery, more reflective, more haunted, as if he's beginning to ask himself a question that terrifies him. What if I didn't just lose my brother? What if I helped push him away? And if that's true, who helped guide that push? This isn't about declaring Meghan Markle a mastermind or Prince Harry a victim. It's about examining how emotional influence operates behind closed doors. It's about acknowledging that relationships don't just change us positively. Sometimes they narrow us. Sometimes they encourage us to burn bridges we may one day wish we could cross again. And sometimes they teach us to see loyalty as a zero-sum game. You're either with me or against me. Harry has never said those exact words publicly about Meghan. But the reported sentiment, echoed by insiders and interpreted through his evolving narrative, suggests something close. A belief that reconciliation with William was discouraged, that peace was framed as weakness, that forgiveness was unnecessary. And if that's true, the cost wasn't just familial. It was generational. Because when brothers stop speaking, it doesn't end with them. It echoes through children, history, legacy. So why does this matter to you? Because this story isn't just about princes. It's about anyone who's ever looked back and wondered whether love asked too much, whether support came with conditions, whether choosing one person meant losing everyone else, and whether the most damaging influence in your life didn't come dressed as an enemy, but as a savior. As we move forward, we're not going to rush. We're going to walk through this slowly. From the bond Harry and William once shared, to the early warnings Harry says he ignored, to the private conversations that allegedly changed everything, and eventually, to the moment Harry may have realized that the wedge wasn't accidental, but intentional. And that realization, if it truly came, arrived far too late. Because once a brother stops answering your calls, words can't undo silence. And that brings us to the beginning. Before Meghan, before the palace fallout, before the interviews, before the wedge, to a time when two boys had only each other and believed nothing could ever come between them. Harry often talks about growing up in the shadow of expectation. But shadows aren't always dark. They can also shelter you. And for him, William was both the shadow and the shelter. The older brother, protector, sometimes critic, and always, unconsciously, the measure of what Harry should be. From the earliest days after their mother's death, the boys clung to each other. They had to. Charles was grieving in public, Diana was gone, and the world expected them to smile, to wave, to carry on. No one asked how they felt, and no one noticed the small fractures forming in their hearts. But they noticed each other. Imagine a 10-year-old Harry, suddenly thrust into grief he doesn't understand, holding the hand of William, a boy barely older, who is trying to keep himself together while trying to protect his brother. That dynamic shaped decades of loyalty. The public sees princes, titles, and ceremonies. They don't see the quiet pact that formed between two brothers who lost their mother too soon and found in each other a lifeline. And that lifeline became absolute. Brothers against the world. William as the anchor, Harry as the stormy spirit, but never alone. The palace, the press, the relentless cameras, they didn't matter as long as they had each other. But here's the irony. The closer they were, the more painful the eventual distance would be. The more someone else entered the picture, the more the stakes grew. Because Harry's relationship with William wasn't just emotional, it was identity-defining. Losing William wasn't just losing a brother. It was losing a compass, a mirror, a part of himself. As teens, they were inseparable. Public appearances, royal duties, even boarding school trips, they were always side by side. Harry learned quickly how to navigate public scrutiny, often by watching William's reactions. William learned from Harry how to handle frustration, how to inject humor into tense situations, and, most importantly, how to love fiercely in a world that constantly demanded stoicism. But being inseparable doesn't mean being identical. William was the cautious, measured one, learning to balance duty and self. Harry was impulsive, fiery, driven by emotion. That contrast was their strength and their Achilles heel. Because when someone came along who understood Harry's emotional side, who offered empathy, validation, and closeness, it created tension. It didn't break them at first, it just planted the seeds. Before Meghan Markle ever entered the picture, before any public scandals or media frenzy, the brothers were already a unit under pressure. The monarchy was demanding, tradition was suffocating, and the world's gaze never left them. Any small disagreement, any minor conflict, was magnified 100-fold. Any breach of trust between them had the potential to echo publicly. The palace staff, of course, noticed the closeness. The advisors, the tutors, the security team, all remarked on it. They were not just brothers. They were a partnership, a team, a duo that could weather anything, together. And for Harry, William's approval was almost addictive. It was the baseline for how he measured his worth, his choices, his identity. This bond was not perfect. No sibling relationship ever is. There were arguments. There were jealousies. Moments when Harry felt William didn't understand him, or William felt Harry acted recklessly. But these were minor cracks compared to the bedrock of trust between them. That bedrock would make the eventual distance even more devastating. Think about what it means to have someone as your emotional North Star. You follow them, you trust them, and you believe that they will always be there. That is what Harry had in William, and that is what would later make the wedge so devastating. Because the deeper the connection, the deeper the wound when distance replaces closeness. The world saw the public face, the princes smiling at events, shaking hands with dignitaries, engaging in charity work. But behind closed doors, there was laughter, camaraderie, mischief, and moments that no photograph could capture. Inside jokes, teasing, shared frustrations about royal life. All of it bound them together. These were not just childhood bonds. They were bonds forged in trauma and reinforced by shared survival. And yet, even in this closeness, there was fragility. Grief leaves marks. Trauma leaves cracks. The boys were learning to navigate adulthood in a pressure cooker environment, without a mother, with a father often absent emotionally, and a world constantly watching. Their bond was strong, but it was also delicate. Enter Meghan Markle. But before we get there, it's crucial to understand the foundation she encountered. She didn't meet two strangers. She met a tightly woven pair of brothers, each dependent on the other in subtle, profound ways. She met Harry, whose loyalty to William was unshakable, whose identity was intertwined with his older brother's approval. And she met William, whose sense of duty and protective instinct over Harry was absolute. When people ask why the alleged wedge was so effective, the answer lies here. The bond was both a strength and a vulnerability. Because someone who could understand Harry, validate him, and subtly guide his perception had immense power, not through force, but through intimacy. Before Meghan, the fractures in the world of the brothers were invisible. They were emotional pressures, private grievances, the kind of disagreements that siblings eventually reconcile. But the foundation was always there, waiting. The bond between Harry and William was unbreakable in appearance, but in reality, it was complex, layered, and susceptible to influence from someone who entered their lives at just the right, or wrong, time. The brothers' shared history also meant that William's reactions carried weight. Every decision Harry made was filtered through the lens of how it might affect his brother, how it might disrupt the fragile equilibrium they had maintained for decades. That is a dynamic few outsiders can comprehend. Loyalty isn't just about love, it's about responsibility, guilt, and a constant evaluation of consequences. And so, when Harry eventually fell in love, when he met someone who promised understanding and validation, the stage was set for tension. Not because the love was wrong, but because the bond with William was profound, absolute, and emotionally defining. Any interference, real or perceived, would cut deep. The story of Harry and William before Meghan is critical to understanding everything that follows. Without it, the alleged wedge, the isolation, the reported manipulation, and the eventual estrangement cannot be fully appreciated. Theirs was a story of brotherhood forged in fire, a story of shared loss, survival, and profound loyalty. And yet, even the strongest bonds can be tested. Even the deepest loyalty can be questioned. Even the most inseparable brothers can find themselves on opposite sides of an invisible line.